Ladies and gentlemen, motivation and focus are often seen as mystical forces available only to the lucky few who are naturally disciplined. But science tells a different story. These qualities are not reserved for a chosen few. They are states created within the brain, states that can be understood, shaped, and trained. To unlock them, we need to look inside the nervous system and the chemistry that drives our behavior. Motivation is often misunderstood as a personality trait that some people are born with and others simply lack. But in reality, it is a dynamic biological state deeply tied to the chemistry of the brain. At the center of this state is dopamine, a powerful neuromodulator that shapes how we think, feel, and act. Dopamine is not about pleasure in the way many people assume. It is much more about drive, anticipation, and the willingness to exert effort toward a goal. When dopamine levels are high, the world feels filled with possibility. Obstacles appear surmountable and energy seems to come from within. When dopamine levels are low, even the simplest tasks can feel overwhelming and the drive to take action seems absent. The reason some days feel filled with momentum while others feel stagnant is not because willpower has disappeared, but because the chemical environment in the brain has shifted. To understand motivation, one must recognize that dopamine is released not just when rewards are obtained, but primarily when rewards are expected. This expectation creates a forward-leaning state, pushing us to act in pursuit of what lies ahead. For example, the excitement one feels before an important event or the energy that arises before starting a new project is not the reward itself, but the dopamine-driven anticipation of reward. This is why progress toward a goal, rather than the final outcome, often carries the strongest sense of motivation. Neuroscientists call this process reward prediction. When the brain anticipates that a certain action will bring about a rewarding outcome, dopamine levels rise, and the body and mind mobilize to pursue that outcome. The release of dopamine does not occur in isolation, but follows specific pathways in the brain. The mesolimbic pathway, which connects deep brain structures to the prefrontal cortex, plays a central role in motivation. Activation of this pathway influences decision making, goal setting, and the perception of effort. When dopamine surges in this pathway, effort itself becomes less taxing. Tasks that once seemed exhausting can suddenly feel energizing. This is why athletes, entrepreneurs, or artists often describe entering a state of flow, where challenges are embraced rather than avoided. What they are experiencing is a neurochemical state fueled by dopamine that changes the perception of work into something inherently rewarding. It is important to note that dopamine operates on a balance of peaks and baselines. The baseline is the resting level of dopamine in the brain, while peaks are the surges that occur in response to anticipation or achievement. After a peak, dopamine always returns to baseline, and if the peaks are too high or too frequent, such as through constant stimulation from social media, gaming, or other instant reward activities, the baseline can drop. When this happens, normal life activities that once felt motivating may feel dull and uninteresting because the brain has adapted to expect higher levels of stimulation. This explains why overindulgence in quick reward behaviors can erode long-term motivation for meaningful pursuits. The good news is that the dopamine system is malleable and can be shaped through deliberate behaviors. One way to leverage dopamine for motivation is to attach meaning to effort itself rather than to the outcome alone. If the brain learns to associate the pursuit of a goal with dopamine release, the journey becomes energizing and sustainable. For example, someone training for a marathon who celebrates each training run as progress, rather than waiting for race day, will reinforce their motivation daily. This creates what neuroscientists call an intrinsic reward loop, where dopamine is released in small but consistent amounts throughout the process, keeping the individual engaged over the long term. Another critical factor is the role of novelty. Dopamine is highly responsive to new experiences, and introducing variety into routines can reignite motivation. Changing the environment, adjusting the way tasks are approached, or introducing new challenges within a familiar pursuit can refresh the dopamine system and prevent stagnation. This is why learning something new or setting a fresh milestone often provides a burst of energy. It is the brain's way of encouraging exploration and growth. Motivation also interacts with stress and rest. Chronic stress depletes dopamine and narrows the capacity for drive, while adequate sleep restores dopamine receptors and replenishes the system. Without proper recovery, the very neurochemical machinery that enables motivation becomes compromised. This is why rest, exercise, and stress regulation are not optional luxuries, but biological requirements for maintaining motivation. Physical movement itself increases dopamine release and receptor sensitivity, explaining why even a short walk or workout can reignite motivation and shift mental states. In essence, motivation is not a mystical quality, but a biological rhythm orchestrated by dopamine. Understanding this allows us to move beyond the illusion of willpower as the sole driver of achievement. By managing dopamine peaks and baselines, by learning to reward the pursuit as much as the outcome, by introducing novelty, and by protecting recovery, anyone can access higher levels of motivation more consistently. This knowledge reframes motivation from something we wait for to something we can actively create through the way we live, think, and act each day. Focus is often assumed to be a gift, something certain people are born with while others struggle endlessly to maintain it. But neuroscience shows that focus is a skill that can be cultivated and strengthened through deliberate practice. At its core, focus is the ability of the brain to filter out irrelevant information and concentrate mental resources on what truly matters. Every moment the senses are bombarded with countless signals, the hum of a fan, the vibration of a phone, a memory surfacing from the past, or the anticipation of a future task. Without focus, these competing signals pull attention in multiple directions, leaving us scattered and unproductive. The brain region most responsible for directing focus is the prefrontal cortex, located just behind the forehead, which acts like the conductor of an orchestra. It coordinates thought, suppresses distractions, and maintains attention on the task at hand. When the prefrontal cortex is functioning well, distractions fade into the background and cognitive energy is directed toward a single goal. This ability to filter and sustain attention does not emerge automatically, but is shaped by practice and environmental conditions. Focus is not an infinite resource. It is fragile and can be depleted when overtaxed. The brain has limited capacity to hold information in working memory, which is the mental space where attention operates. This limitation means multitasking is largely a myth. Shifting between tasks forces the brain to constantly reorient, draining energy and reducing efficiency. Each switch of attention comes at a cost, fragmenting the ability to stay immersed. True focus Therefore, is the art of maintaining stability in the face of competing demands, not juggling multiple priorities at once. Biological rhythms strongly influence the ability to focus. Humans naturally move through cycles of alertness, known as ultradian rhythms, lasting about 90 minutes each. Within these windows, the brain can sustain deep focus, but as the cycle ends, attention wanes and rest becomes necessary. Ignoring these cycles leads to mental fatigue, procrastination, and reduced cognitive performance. Understanding these rhythms allows individuals to schedule demanding work during peaks of alertness and take deliberate breaks to recharge. By aligning tasks with natural cycles rather than forcing the brain to push endlessly, focus can be optimized in a sustainable way. The chemistry of focus also depends heavily on neurotransmitters such as dopamine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. Dopamine drives motivation, norepinephrine increases alertness, and acetylcholine sharpens the brain's ability to lock in on specific tasks. When these chemicals are balanced, the mind feels clear and directed. When they are disrupted by stress, fatigue, or overstimulation, attention fragments and focus becomes difficult to maintain. This explains why poor sleep or constant digital distraction quickly erodes concentration. The neurochemical systems that support focus are sensitive and require care to function at their best. Training focus involves building the ability to return attention to the present task whenever it wanders. This does not mean eliminating distractions entirely, but learning to notice when attention drifts and deliberately redirecting it. Practices like meditation, breath control, or even deliberate stillness train the prefrontal cortex to strengthen this capacity. Over time, the brain becomes better at sustaining attention and less reactive to distractions. Just as muscles grow through repetition and strain, focus strengthens through consistent training and recovery. The environment plays a crucial role in shaping focus. Visual clutter, background noise, or constant notifications increase the cognitive load on the brain, forcing the prefrontal cortex to work harder just to maintain concentration. By designing an environment that minimizes unnecessary stimuli, focus can be preserved more effectively. Even small changes, such as silencing devices, reducing visual noise, or creating specific work rituals, signal to the brain that it is time to concentrate. Over time, these environmental cues become powerful triggers that prime the mind for deep focus automatically. Another important aspect of focus is the way goals are structured. The brain struggles to hold vague or abstract tasks in attention. Specific, actionable steps anchor focus far better than ambiguous objectives. For instance, write one page of the report provides a clear target for attention, while work on the report leaves too much room for distraction. By breaking larger goals into smaller, concrete actions, the brain has something tangible to concentrate on, which reduces mental resistance and enhances clarity. Focus is also deeply influenced by meaning. When a task feels connected to something personally valuable, the brain assigns greater salience to it, making distractions easier to ignore. This is because the prefrontal cortex prioritizes information based on relevance to goals and values. Tasks devoid of meaning require far greater effort to maintain attention, while meaningful pursuits naturally pull attention toward them. By linking tasks to broader purposes or personal values, focus becomes less of a struggle and more of a natural pull. Rest and recovery remain essential to sustaining focus over time. When the brain is overloaded with information or deprived of sleep, the neural circuits that support attention weaken. Sleep is particularly vital because it restores neurotransmitter levels and strengthens connections between neurons, effectively resetting the system for the next day. Without this reset, focus quickly unravels, no matter how strong one's intentions may be. Movement and exercise also play a powerful role in sharpening focus, as they increase blood flow to the brain and enhance the chemical systems that regulate attention. Ultimately, focus is not an innate talent reserved for a select few, but a skill rooted in the biology of the brain, shaped by practice, environment, and daily rhythms. It emerges when distractions are managed, when goals are clear, when neurochemistry is balanced, and when effort is applied consistently. By training the prefrontal cortex, aligning work with natural rhythms, designing supportive environments, and restoring the system through rest, anyone can significantly strengthen their ability to focus. The science shows that focus is not something we wait for, but something we build through the deliberate choices we make every day. ChatGPT said, "Motivation and focus are not constant resources that remain the same throughout the day, but rather states that ebb and flow in response to the body's biological rhythms. These rhythms are hardwired into the nervous system and determine when the brain is most capable of deep concentration, when energy peaks, and when rest is most needed. One of the most influential rhythms is the circadian rhythm, the roughly 24-hour cycle that governs sleep, alertness, and hormone release. Within this rhythm, levels of cortisol, melatonin, and dopamine fluctuate, creating natural windows where the brain is primed for effort and windows where it leans toward recovery. For instance, in the early hours after waking, cortisol naturally rises, promoting alertness and readiness. This biological surge is not merely about waking up, but about sharpening focus and mobilizing energy. Later in the evening, melatonin begins to rise, signaling the brain to transition toward rest. These shifts are not under conscious control, but by aligning tasks with them, a person can multiply productivity rather than working against their own biology. Beyond the circadian rhythm, there are ultradian rhythms, cycles of about 90 minutes, during which the brain naturally oscillates between states of high focus and dips in energy. Within these cycles, neural activity organizes into bursts of concentration, followed by subtle declines where distraction becomes more tempting. Pushing through these declines without rest often leads to mental fatigue, procrastination, and mistakes. On the other hand, respecting these rhythms by working in 90-minute blocks and then taking deliberate breaks allows the brain to restore resources and re-enter deep focus repeatedly throughout the day. This is why people often notice that their best work happens in defined sprints rather than in stretched hours of continuous effort. Dopamine plays a critical role in these rhythms because its release is not uniform across the day. Early in the morning, dopamine levels tend to be higher, especially when combined with natural light exposure and movement, creating a neurochemical foundation for motivation. Later in the day, dopamine naturally dips, and if a person attempts to take on their hardest tasks during these dips, motivation feels lacking. However, by reserving routine or less demanding tasks for those lower energy periods, the rhythm can be leveraged rather than fought against. This pattern is not about forcing motivation at all times, but about working in harmony with the natural rise and fall of the brain's chemistry. Focus, too, follows these cycles. The prefrontal cortex, which governs attention and cognitive control, functions most effectively during peaks of alertness. During dips, distractions are harder to resist, and the ability to maintain working memory declines. If a person tries to maintain deep concentration during a biological lull, the experience feels like fighting an uphill battle. Recognizing these cycles allows for strategic scheduling, placing creative, analytical, or demanding tasks at times when the brain is primed and leaving routine or recovery activities for when attention is naturally lower. These rhythms also explain why motivation and focus often feel unpredictable. On some days, energy seems abundant, while on others it feels scarce, yet the underlying pattern is not random. It is governed by the body's interaction with light, sleep, nutrition, and activity. Exposure to natural light in the morning anchors the circadian rhythm, signaling the body to wake up and setting the stage for better focus throughout the day. Lack of light exposure or irregular sleep disrupts this rhythm, leading to grogginess, poor concentration, and reduced motivation. Similarly, inconsistent sleep schedules can throw off both circadian and ultradian rhythms, creating misalignment between the body's natural cycles and the demands of daily life. Another factor that interacts with these rhythms is the concept of effort allocation. Because motivation peaks and dips throughout the day, conserving cognitive energy for the right moments is essential. Constant multitasking or unnecessary distractions deplete dopamine and overload the prefrontal cortex, leaving fewer resources available during the natural peaks. By guarding attention during high performance windows and intentionally resting during dips, motivation can be stretched further without burning out. This principle explains why some of the most effective performers structure their day into cycles of deep work followed by deliberate recovery rather than attempting endless hours of unfocused effort. Stress also influences these cycles. In short bursts, stress can sharpen focus by releasing adrenaline and increasing alertness. But chronic stress disrupts the delicate balance of dopamine and cortisol. When stress levels remain high, ultradian cycles flatten, making it harder to detect natural peaks and valleys. In this state, motivation feels blunted and focus becomes erratic. This is why recovery practices such as proper sleep, physical movement, and relaxation are not luxuries, but necessary recalibrations of the system that restore the natural oscillations of focus and drive. Nutrition and hydration further shape the impact of these rhythms. Blood sugar fluctuations can amplify dips in ultradian cycles, making fatigue feel more pronounced, while balanced meals support stable energy levels that align better with biological peaks. Hydration supports optimal neural function, as even slight dehydration impairs concentration. By managing these external factors, one can stabilize the natural rhythms rather than allowing them to be thrown off course. Ultimately, the science of motivation and focus reveals that the brain is not designed for constant effort. It operates in waves, guided by circadian and ultradian rhythms, by fluctuations in neurochemistry, and by the body's need for balance between exertion and recovery. The individuals who appear to have limitless motivation are not defying biology, but working in harmony with it, aligning their most demanding efforts with their natural peaks of energy and protecting their dips with deliberate rest. Understanding and respecting these rhythms transforms motivation and focus from unreliable states into predictable tools that can be used intentionally throughout the day. ChatGPT said, "Every time a person achieves something, No matter how small, a biological process unfolds in the brain that reinforces motivation and strengthens the drive to continue. This process is rooted in the release of dopamine, the neurotransmitter most closely tied to reward and pursuit. Many assume dopamine is only released in response to major achievements or life-changing events, but the science shows it is far more nuanced. Dopamine is released whenever the brain perceives progress toward a goal, and this release does not scale only with the size of the accomplishment. A seemingly minor win, such as completing a workout, finishing a paragraph of writing, or solving a small problem at work, can produce a noticeable surge of dopamine. That surge does more than create a brief sense of satisfaction. It rewires the nervous system to associate effort with reward and primes the brain to seek out the next step on the path forward. This dynamic is why small wins accumulate into large surges of motivation. Each step forward is not only progress in the external world, but also reinforcement in the internal world of the brain's chemistry. Dopamine acts like a teaching signal, telling the nervous system that the behaviors leading to that small success were valuable and should be repeated. Over time, this process creates a feedback loop. Success leads to dopamine release. Dopamine makes the next step more appealing, and the repetition of this cycle builds momentum. Large goals, when broken down into small, achievable steps, therefore provide many more opportunities for dopamine reinforcement. Instead of waiting for the faraway satisfaction of a completed project or major milestone, the brain learns to generate motivation continuously through repeated reinforcement along the way. This mechanism explains why people often lose motivation when they set only distant or overly large goals. If the brain has no small checkpoints to trigger dopamine release, the pursuit feels endless and unrewarding, even if the end goal is deeply meaningful. Without those incremental surges of reinforcement, effort feels detached from reward and motivation eventually collapses. By contrast, when goals are broken into clear, actionable steps, the brain is rewarded regularly and effort feels purposeful and energizing. This is not just a psychological trick, but a biological principle built into how the nervous system evolved to encourage sustained pursuit. Dopamine's role in reinforcing small wins also influences how people perceive challenges. When the brain anticipates that progress is possible, dopamine rises and motivation follows. When progress feels impossible or undefined, dopamine drops and the system withdraws energy. By deliberately framing challenges as a series of small, solvable steps, one can harness this neurochemical mechanism to maintain drive even in the face of daunting obstacles. The act of achieving one step, no matter how small, restores dopamine and renews the energy to continue. This creates resilience because the brain learns to attach reward to the process itself rather than to distant, uncertain outcomes. The reinforcing power of small wins extends beyond motivation into the sharpening of focus. Dopamine does not only generate drive, it also improves the ability of the prefrontal cortex to filter distractions and direct attention. This means every small win not only builds momentum, but also increases the brain's capacity to stay concentrated on the next step. A person who experiences consistent reinforcement through incremental achievements is neurologically better equipped to maintain deep focus than someone who waits only for large successes. Over time, this creates a compounding effect where small wins multiply both motivation and focus, accelerating progress far more effectively than sporadic bursts of achievement. However, the way small wins are celebrated and perceived also matters. If achievements are constantly paired with external rewards that are unrelated to the task itself, such as indulging in distractions after every minor step, the brain begins to associate dopamine release with the external reward rather than with the process of effort. This weakens the intrinsic motivation loop and can reduce long-term drive. By contrast, when the satisfaction of the small win is acknowledged internally and effort itself is framed as valuable, the brain learns to sustain motivation without requiring constant external stimulation. This distinction is crucial because it determines whether the dopamine system builds resilience and focus or becomes dependent on shallow rewards. This principle is visible in many areas of life. Athletes use training logs to track incremental improvements, reinforcing motivation with each recorded gain. Writers set daily word counts to generate consistent dopamine surges with every milestone. Students break study sessions into manageable segments, rewarding themselves with the sense of progress, rather than waiting for final exams to provide validation. In each case, the secret to long-term motivation lies not in the size of the win, but in the frequency and perception of wins along the journey. Biologically, small wins create patterns of synaptic strengthening in the brain, where neural circuits associated with successful behaviors become more efficient and more likely to be activated in the future. This means each small win does not only produce temporary motivation, but also shapes the brain to make similar wins more accessible. Over weeks and months, this creates enduring behavioral change and makes sustained pursuit feel increasingly natural. The science of small wins reveals that motivation is not best fueled by the distant promise of a major reward, but by the steady reinforcement of progress. Each minor success is an opportunity for the brain to release dopamine, sharpen focus, and reinforce effort. By deliberately breaking goals into smaller steps and learning to appreciate the neurochemical power of these incremental achievements, motivation becomes less fragile and more sustainable. This transforms the pursuit of any goal from a distant, uphill struggle into a series of reinforcing steps that build momentum, resilience, and focus along the way. Stress and lack of sleep are two of the most powerful forces that undermine both motivation and focus, because they directly interfere with the delicate balance of brain chemistry that makes these states possible. When a person is well rested, dopamine pathways operate smoothly, the prefrontal cortex functions effectively, and attention can be directed with precision. But when sleep is cut short or stress is prolonged, these same systems begin to malfunction, creating a state where effort feels heavier. Concentration slips away, and motivation collapses. It is not simply a matter of feeling tired or distracted. It is a biological disruption of the very circuits that regulate drive and attention. Sleep plays a fundamental role in restoring the brain's capacity for motivation. During deep sleep and REM sleep, dopamine receptors are reset, neurotransmitters are replenished, and the neural circuits that govern focus are repaired. This nightly reset ensures that the next day, the brain is capable of generating the chemical signals necessary to sustain effort and resist distraction. Without adequate sleep, dopamine levels drop, and the sensitivity of dopamine receptors decreases. This means the brain is less able to generate the neurochemical signals that normally make effort feel rewarding. As a result, The individual may know logically what needs to be done, but feels an overwhelming resistance to doing it. This mismatch between intention and drive is one of the most common consequences of sleep deprivation. Stress exerts a similar disruptive effect, though through slightly different mechanisms. In small bursts, stress can sharpen focus and increase alertness by releasing adrenaline and cortisol. But when stress is prolonged, these same chemicals begin to impair dopamine release and weaken the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the region responsible for attention, planning, and suppressing distractions, and under chronic stress, it loses control to deeper brain circuits that prioritize immediate threats. This shift makes it harder to concentrate on long-term goals and easier to be pulled toward distractions or impulsive behaviors. Motivation suffers because the brain becomes locked into survival mode, conserving energy and seeking quick relief rather than sustained effort. Together, lack of sleep and stress create a vicious cycle. Stress often interferes with sleep, making it difficult to fall or stay asleep. Poor sleep then amplifies the brain's sensitivity to stress, making even small challenges feel overwhelming. As this cycle continues, dopamine pathways degrade further, leading to a state of chronic low motivation and scattered focus. The person may describe feeling burned out, but what is really happening is a breakdown in the neurochemical systems that support sustained drive and cognitive control. The effects of this cycle are visible in daily behavior. Tasks that once felt achievable suddenly seem impossible to start. The mind jumps from one thought to another, unable to stay anchored on a single point. Small setbacks trigger outsized frustration because the brain's ability to regulate emotions is compromised. Over time, this erodes not only productivity, but also confidence, as the individual begins to believe they lack discipline or willpower. In truth, the problem lies not in character, but in biology. Without protecting sleep and managing stress, the nervous system cannot sustain the conditions necessary for motivation and focus to flourish. The good news is that the brain can recover quickly when these factors are addressed. Even a single night of high-quality sleep can restore dopamine receptor sensitivity, making effort feel rewarding again. Practices that reduce stress, such as physical exercise, deliberate breathing, or time in nature, can lower cortisol and reestablish the balance between the prefrontal cortex and deeper brain circuits. These interventions do not simply provide psychological relief, they restore the biological machinery that makes focus and motivation possible. Exercise in particular is a powerful reset. Movement increases dopamine release, enhances blood flow to the brain, and reduces stress hormones. It provides a natural counterbalance to the chemical disruptions caused by sleep deprivation and chronic stress. Even a short session of physical activity can reignite motivation and sharpen attention. Similarly, deliberate breathing techniques can quickly shift the body out of a stress-dominated state by influencing the autonomic nervous system, reducing cortisol, and restoring cognitive control. Consistent routines around sleep are equally critical. Going to bed and waking up at the same time anchors the circadian rhythm, making it easier for the brain to release hormones and neurotransmitters in predictable cycles. Exposure to natural light in the morning helps reinforce this rhythm, ensuring that energy peaks occur when they are most needed for focused work. Avoiding overstimulation late at night, such as from bright screens or caffeine, supports melatonin release and prepares the brain for restorative rest. These seemingly simple habits directly influence the neurochemical balance that governs motivation and focus the following day. The lesson from science is that motivation and focus are not matters of raw willpower. They are the product of a brain whose chemistry is either supported or sabotaged by lifestyle factors. Sleep and stress are two of the most influential of these factors because they determine whether dopamine systems function or fail, whether the prefrontal cortex can maintain control, and whether attention is sharp or scattered. By protecting sleep, reducing chronic stress, and engaging in restorative practices, the brain is given the chance to reset, replenish, and return to a state where effort feels energizing rather than exhausting. What often appears as a lack of discipline is, in truth, a lack of biological support. When the nervous system is cared for, motivation and focus emerge naturally and reliably, allowing goals to be pursued with clarity and persistence. Motivation is often imagined as the energy that arrives when a person thinks about a grand goal or a distant achievement, but neuroscience shows that this is not how the system works most effectively. The brain is not designed to sustain drive over long stretches of time based on a single faraway outcome. Instead, motivation is maintained by attaching meaning to small, actionable steps and generating consistent reinforcement through progress. When the brain perceives that an action is both achievable and connected to something valuable, dopamine is released, creating a sense of forward momentum. This process transforms effort from a burden into something that feels worthwhile, even energizing. It is not the distant reward itself, but the act of moving toward it in small increments that sustains motivation day after day. Large goals, while inspiring, often overwhelm the brain's motivational systems because they lack immediate reinforcement. The nervous system thrives on feedback, and when that feedback is too far removed from action, the dopamine system fails to engage consistently. This is why people may set ambitious resolutions or long-term targets, but find their drive fading after the initial excitement. The brain requires small checkpoints to generate the neurochemical signals that sustain pursuit. Each time progress is measured in concrete steps, dopamine rises, sharpening focus and renewing energy for the next action. Without this steady reinforcement, effort begins to feel disconnected from reward, and motivation declines no matter how meaningful the distant outcome may be. Breaking goals into small, specific steps is not just a strategy of productivity, but a biological necessity. When the brain can clearly identify the next immediate action, such as reading a single page, completing a short workout, or writing one paragraph, it perceives the task as attainable. The successful completion of that step triggers dopamine release, which creates a sense of satisfaction and readiness for the next step. Over time, these incremental reinforcements accumulate, creating a strong loop where action leads to progress leads to dopamine, and dopamine leads to more action. This cycle transforms motivation from a fleeting state into a sustainable process. The role of meaning is equally critical. Dopamine is not only released when goals are achieved, but also when effort is connected to something personally significant. If a task feels devoid of meaning, even small wins provide little reinforcement. However, when each action is framed as part of a meaningful pursuit, dopamine release is amplified and motivation is easier to sustain. For example, studying one chapter of a textbook feels very different if it is perceived as merely checking off a requirement compared to viewing it as one step toward building a future career. The brain interprets meaning as salience, and salience drives attention and effort. By linking immediate actions to larger values or aspirations, the nervous system interprets each step as part of a bigger story, making the process itself more rewarding. This principle explains why people often feel energized when working on projects that align with their core values. The effort itself is experienced as meaningful, and the brain reinforces that effort with steady dopamine release. On the other hand, when goals are detached from personal significance, motivation becomes fragile, dependent on external pressure or fleeting bursts of inspiration. Sustained motivation, therefore, requires not only breaking goals into small steps, but also ensuring that those steps are tied to something that matters deeply to the individual. The combination of action and meaning is what keeps the dopamine system engaged over the long term. Focus benefits from this process as well. The prefrontal cortex, which controls attention, relies on dopamine to prioritize relevant tasks and suppress distractions. When small steps are clearly defined and infused with meaning, the brain finds it easier to stay locked onto the task at hand. Vague or meaningless tasks scatter attention because the brain struggles to assign salience to them. Specific, meaningful actions, on the other hand, provide a clear target for focus, making it more natural to resist distractions. Thus, the strategy of breaking down goals and attaching meaning not only sustains motivation, but also sharpens focus, creating a powerful synergy between drive and attention. Sustaining motivation through small steps and meaning also protects against the common pitfalls of procrastination and burnout. Procrastination often arises when tasks feel too large or too detached from reward, creating a gap between action and dopamine release. By narrowing the gap with immediate, meaningful steps, the brain receives the reinforcement it craves, making it easier to begin. Burnout occurs when effort is expended without perceived progress or meaning, depleting dopamine and leaving the brain in a state of low drive. Small, meaningful wins prevent this depletion by ensuring that effort is regularly rewarded and connected to something valuable. Over time, this approach reshapes the way the brain perceives effort itself. Instead of being viewed as a cost to be endured until a distant payoff, effort becomes part of the reward process. The nervous system learns to associate energy expenditure with meaning and progress, creating a durable form of motivation that does not depend on constant external rewards or unrealistic bursts of willpower. This reframing turns daily actions into opportunities for reinforcement and transforms motivation into a self-sustaining cycle. The science of motivation, therefore, shows that drive is not maintained by waiting for inspiration or by focusing exclusively on distant outcomes. It is built by structuring goals into small, clear steps, attaching meaning to those steps, and allowing the brain's dopamine system to reinforce progress continuously. When action and meaning are combined, motivation becomes less about forcing effort and more about naturally moving forward. This is how consistent long-term pursuit is sustained, not by relying on rare surges of inspiration, but by engaging the nervous system in a cycle of effort, progress, and meaning that fuels itself each day.